Hi everybody, welcome to another edition of News from World in Flux. My name's Clare Farrell.
I'm Charlie Gardner.
Today we're going to be covering some new research that's come out about the wet bulb effect. Don't worry, we'll explain what it is if you've never heard of it. Charlie has some actual personal research to talk about the future of forests in the UK and how species migrate or may need assistance with migration in a warming world. And then we're going to just focus in on a little bit of an update on activism in the UK. Lots of people still in jail cells. Lots to say about the context that we're working in. So let's go first onto the wet bulb topic, Charlie. It feels to me like it's not something that is very widely known about. If you went up to the person on the street and said, do you know what wet bulb means? I don't think you'd get very many yeses. What is this new research about it?
Our bodies need to maintain a constant temperature. If our core body temperature reaches 40 degrees or 40.2 degrees, we suffer heat stroke and die. So we need to cool ourselves down when it's really hot. And the way we do that is we sweat. So when we sweat and the sweat evaporates off our skin into the air, that has a real cooling effect. And when it's hot, that's really effective. But when it's hot and humid, the air is already saturated with moisture so that your sweat can't evaporate. And that means we don't have the natural mechanism to cool our body down. So that means the only remaining mechanism to cool down is a behavioural one. Go and find somewhere cool, turn on the air conditioning, or jump in some cold water. The wet bulb temperature it's basically just a composite measure of temperature and humidity, and it gets its name because the way you measure it is if you put a damp cloth around the thermometer and swing it around your head, that gives you the wet bulb temperature because it replicates the temperature in a fully humid environment. So it used to be thought that the wet bulb temperature that would lead to catastrophic effects on the human body and eventually death was about 35 degrees. So that's not temperature, that's wet bulb temperature. What this research did was use some novel experimental techniques. So I think the research that had suggested that the wet bulb temperature of 35 degrees was fatal was largely modelling based. This research was based on actual experiments on people in a laboratory. And they found that the fatal wet bulb temperature is actually much lower. So it's probably 32 degrees if you're doing zero activity and 27 degrees if you're doing really, really mild activity. So these data are really, really terrifying. The thing about these fatal wet bulb temperatures is that we almost never reach them on Earth, or we almost never reach them on Earth in the stable climate that we're leaving. There are projections for us to reach these temperatures more and more frequently. And of course, now that the fatal temperature has been brought down, we're going to reach that much, much more frequently. Our projections that the places which will start to encounter these wet bulb temperatures are likely to be the Middle East and India. These are places where people rely heavily on air conditioning, just to survive in the temperatures we have now. Of course, in India, air conditioning is not very widely available, only to the elites of Indian society or the middle classes. Rural people don't have access to it. But even in big cities, the idea of us reaching fatal wet bulb temperatures in a city and everyone only being kept alive by air conditioning is really frightening, given the vulnerability of electrical grids and things like that in extreme temperatures. We are approaching levels of climate change that means we could suffer mass catastrophe events. Of course, we have mass catastrophe events through flooding and fires and things. But the thing with big fires and floods is that people can evacuate. We know they're coming. People can go elsewhere that won't be affected. If we reach these fatal wet bulb temperatures over a large area, people won't be able to evacuate. There's literally nowhere else they can go, because everywhere for tens of miles or even hundreds of miles might be suffering these conditions. So it's a terrifying prospect, and this research brings down the level of temperature at which we can expect to see these things.
I mean, the thing with these kind of big events that you're saying where people can evacuate, of course, you've seen in the recent past massive wildfires in Australia, for example, where you can look at that situation and say the death count was quite low considering the volume of property that was wiped out, precisely because the people there are, relatively speaking, quite affluent and able to get away. The state can put a naval ship on the coast for people to go and get onto, whatever. There are ways that wealthy countries can deal with these things, which people in poorer countries can't, where they don't have infrastructure the same way. They don't have
warning systems.
Yeah, they don't have so much services, warning systems, all the rest of it. Speaking about India as well, in terms of this wet bulb, it sort of brings to mind, obviously, the opening of Ministry for the Future by Kim Stanley Robinson, which opens with a wet bulb event, which I think is set in 2025. And, where there are people throwing themselves in lakes to try and cool down, but it doesn't work because they're so hot. And in that sort of time of mass death and many bodies being hauled up on the roofs of buildings to be out of the way because they're piling up and they stink. I mean, it's a harrowing read. There's also a lot of social unrest and basically, fighting and theft and all manner of things being done to try and get people access to aircon, where they're out to steal air conditioning units from each other, or they're breaking into places where they have them, desperately trying to get access to a place that's cool enough that you can live, because people are on the brink. And I mean, if this research is suggesting that the temperature and humidity threshold that we maybe thought was the one for the marker for this, and that's been brought down very substantially to something that we know we're going to experience in more places much sooner. But that feels like it leads, in my mind anyway, towards something that lots of people are thinking about at the moment, in terms of like how people are going to organise themselves in these kinds of situations, right? And what kind of collective support systems can you have in place for this kind of stuff? I mean, is that part of the conversation in the academic space around this research, or not really? So
this is the difficult thing about academia, is it's so siloed. People work in their specialisms. There's not really any discussion amongst these researchers about what's required. These are, physiologists that know about the human body. The people that will be planning responses to this are social scientists and urban planners and others that work in very, very different fields. And so it's quite rare in academia to get big teams of researchers from different fields that will work on a project that tells the whole story, from emerging problem to also address adaptive responses to that problem. It just, you don't see it very much. And it's because the scientific process is so siloed in at different stages, so this research will only be published in one kind of journal that deals with that stuff, and then the response has to be published in a governance journal or an urban planning journal or something else. So we do lack this kind of joined up thinking amongst researchers, which makes it all the more important that that governments do so, but they're not, which is why it's having to be left to people working in social and environmental spaces to start pushing these conversations. It leaves us quite poorly adapted to this emergency situation that we have, because we don't have time for slow processes, for one area of thinking to make it from these scientists to the other. We don't have time for siloed thinking. We're in a time of huge complexity. We need systems thinking to respond to it. And unfortunately, just like every other type of institution we have, our academic institutions are designed for a time of stability and a time of slow change and a non-emergency time. And that's a real problem that underlies all our responses as a society, I think.
Whenever I hear wet bulb, I think of that guy Andrew Forrest, an Australian mining industry, I don't know, magnate. I don't really know what that word means, but he's one of those.
Boss man.
He's big man in Australian mining, and he did this amazing speech, which I'm sure we'll be able to link in the notes. But it was the most extraordinary piece of climate communications, wasn't it? He basically went to an industry conference and described the bodily experience of how wet bulb and overheating to the point of death actually sort of cooks your body from the inside, and the horror of what that does, and saying this is what is going to happen with increasing incidences of wet bulb. It's our fault as business, and basically crying out for people to just stop them. At the moment, I feel like this echoes again and again, week after week or month after month, when we get together talking about how, this is literally people who appear to have an awful lot of power and influence in a system that they're going, please stop me from killing everybody. Please stop us. Yeah. And it doesn't feel like anyone's actually got a serious solution to this bind, does it?
Other than just to thank those that speak up and say, well done you for speaking up, but not actually acting on it. I mean, there's so many reasons for that. I think a big one is that so much of our society is run by the private sector, and the private sector sort of has its hands tied. It's tied its own hands because it's always seeking profit. And that's always the number one goal. It's a fiduciary duty. They have a legal duty to their shareholders to seek profit all the time, not to transition themselves to becoming a better adapted or more sustainable organisation. So, the private sector's in this crazy bind where individual organisations might know that if they don't utterly transform, they just simply won't exist in 10 or 20 years. They won't be there because the world will have changed, and if they haven't changed, they won't be there. And yet, all their structural incentives are focused on making sure you make a profit in the next quarter. And you can't do both. You can't transform your whole organisation whilst pursuing a profit in the next quarter. It's really difficult, which is why, yet another reason why we need strong government regulation to force the private sector to do what society needs it to do. The
similarity then between this conversation and the next piece that we're going to move on to, which is your research about, a heating world and whether or not nature can migrate at a pace that temperatures are changing in order to try and keep up in some way. Somebody that I met years ago through a Newsnight appearance, and she was telling me about how when she was a young woman, she had been campaigning, and this is like Greenham Common times or soon after, so it's quite a while back, that part of their work, their messaging, their campaigning was precisely about global warming is going to mean that nature can't move fast enough. And this is, you go back that far in time, you think, fucking hell, it wasn't very fast then compared to what it is now. But, you know, the trees and the animals need to move at a certain number of meters or miles or whatever per year to be able to keep pace with like increasing temperatures. Now, obviously, I think now the world is not just getting hotter, it's also getting colder in some places, it's also getting more extremities, it's also, we're looking at, you know, the deterioration of the Gulf Stream, AMOC, all of these other things that you would say, actually, it ain't that simple, it's not just getting hot. But like, can you just introduce for everyone, like, what is this research about, in particular around trees?
So this is a piece that of work that I carried out with James Bullock, who's a colleague of mine in Scientists for Extinction Rebellion. He works for the Centre of Ecology and Hydrology, which is a government research institution. And we asked the question, you know, what do we need to do to ensure that we have forests in the south of England in the future? Because, yeah, as you say, things are changing very fast. We lack detailed projections for what climate of southern England is going to look like in the near future. But there was a piece that came out a few years ago. It used this idea of city analogues. It was saying, if we're going to be able to imagine what the climate is going to be like in city X in the future, then one way would be to compare it to what a different city is like now. So they twinned all these cities, and they said that by 2050, the climate of London will be like what the climate of Barcelona is like now, right? Barcelona's, you know, it's Mediterranean, it's hot. So that's 2050, that's soon.
Really scary.
The thing is, of all the species of plant and animal that make up our forest in the south of England, very few of them could survive in the conditions that Barcelona has. So what we'll see more and more over the coming decades is more and more adult trees will die, fewer and fewer seedlings will successfully become adult trees, and, you know, our forest will become less and less resilient, and they might collapse. Normally, what would happen is that you might get replacement species coming in from further south. So species have always moved in response to climate change. So until about 10,000 years ago, most of Britain was under glaciers. Glaciers came as far down as Norfolk, where I was, and then the south of England was tundra, right? So obviously, every species in Scotland now, Scotland was under a mile of ice. Every species of plant and animal in Scotland now has moved there as the climate, as the ice retreated. So species have always moved in response to this. And it's happening again now. It's happening in a big way. So the distributions of tree species around Europe are changing. Loads and loads of trees are dying. We're having mass mortality events in forests all around Europe now. But what our paper said was that if the trees that will be able to thrive in southern England in the future aren't there now, how are they going to get there? And we compared Britain to mainland Europe. On mainland Europe, say, take a patch of northern France or Germany or something, as the northern cold adapted species of tree start to die out, there'll be new species of tree moving north from the south. And on mainland Europe, they might be able to colonize. So we'll get a change in the species that make up the forest, but there might still be a forest.
Right.
The northern species die, southern species come in, you still have a forest. In Britain, it's different because we're an island. So, you've got these whole communities of plants and animals moving northwards through Europe. They reach the English Channel. Some of them, the birds and the insects that can fly, and the trees that have tiny seeds that disperse in the wind, they all make it across fine, and we welcome them with open arms. These are natural colonizers. They made it here by themselves. welcome. But there's loads of things. All the mammals that don't fly, so everything apart from bats, all the reptiles, all the insects, the beetles that live in the leaf litter that don't fly, all the worms and soil invertebrates and stuff, they can't make it across the channel. And wildlife conservationists are, as a whole, we're really reluctant to consider the idea that we should actually bring them over. Because one of the biggest threats to biodiversity in the past has been the introduction of non-native species.
Yeah.
Invasive species can be a problem, particularly on isolated islands where there aren't rich communities, because you introduce something, it doesn't have any predators, it doesn't have any diseases, so it just goes wild, and this is a real problem. And since we have such a big history of problems of introduced species becoming invasive, we're like, oh well, we can't deliberately introduce something because that might go wrong. It might go wrong. Yeah. But I just think this is completely the wrong way to think about it. I think everything is on the move now. So the very idea of native and not native, it's just not really relevant anymore, I don't think. We want to have nice, rich, functioning, resilient forests in the future, because it's not just about wildlife conservation. Everyone loves forests. They're lovely places to be, they give us joy, they help they help in nutrient cycling, they help reduce flooding, they help affect the weather. Forests are just great. If we don't actively import European tree species, then we'll just be ensuring that our forests are less full of species and less resilient. And it's not like we'd be bringing in other trees from Australia or South America that, very, very different things. All we'd be doing is bringing in species that are a natural component of these European forests that are expanding north. Why would we choose to have less resilient and less species-rich forests than Belgium or Holland? And particularly because everyone else apart from wildlife conservationists is already doing this. So gardeners are constantly bringing in new varieties and new species that are adapted to the future conditions we'll have. Farmers are constantly bringing in new species. The forestry industry, which is, they also work in forests, but their interest is timber, not wildlife. They're doing it. They've got no hesitation in bringing in warm adapted species because they know they're the only species that will grow here in future. So everybody's doing this except wildlife conservationists, because we have this idea of native and non-native species. So it's really controversial, but I think it's really important to start considering this, because we have to start looking to the future. Conservation has always been like, let's try to keep the nature we have now, let's try to maintain the nature we have now and stop it changing. But with climate change, that's just not possible, is it? These forests are going to change. There's nothing we can do to stop them changing. So we should at least try to mold that change, try to shape the direction of that change rather than just ignoring it. There's that old proverb, the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago, the next best time is now. Well, we adapted that proverb in our paper. We said the best time to start planning and facilitating the ecosystems of tomorrow was 30 years ago, but we're just not doing it. And I think there's a lot of implications of that. One of the reasons why I think people or conservationists are reluctant to bring in new species from elsewhere, it's not just the idea of invasive species, it's also about our sense of place. One of the reasons why we want to conserve nature is because nature's part of the places that we know. Like even people that live in London, there are certain kinds of street tree that we have, and that might be, for a lot of people, they might have a sense of attachment to that. This kind of tree is part of my sense of place, and this is part of what I want to conserve. And so the idea of having completely different trees is difficult. And I just think we've got to change the conversation a bit. The question is, do we want to have trees in England in the future? And the answer is a clear yes. So if they're not here already and they can't get here, then obviously we'll have to bring them in.
Give them a lift.
Give them a lift. It's not that controversial really, but it shouldn't be controversial, but it is. But I think it also raises much bigger issues. So much of our world is based on geographical organization. Like, we're organized into countries basically, right? And it's a real problem in all sorts of ways. So when we talk about nature, for example, species reorganizing themselves all over the globe, lines on a map make no difference to that at all, but they do make a big difference to how we respond to it. So I was talking to a coral biologist the other day, or coral conservationist in the Caribbean, and he's like, I'm trying to do this assisted colonization of corals from one island to the next in the Caribbean, but I can't because the permitting is too difficult. There's one government there, and we have built human systems that are preventing us from reorganizing ourselves across the country, across the globe as we need to. And this is we're seeing this more and more now with human migration too. So as conditions change, it's not just nature that has to be on the move. We've already seen we talked about how wet bulb temperature will make some places difficult to live. And remember, it doesn't have to reach wet bulb temperature every day to make a place uninhabitable. It just has to happen once or twice and the place is completely uninhabitable. What climate change means is that just as the south of England will not be suitable for oak trees or ash trees in the future, it also means Middle East and North Africa and the Horn of Africa and much of India will not be suitable for human beings in the future. Humans will not be able to live there. The only answer to that then, the only conceivable answer, is that people will have to move. We will encounter just enormous human migration. And obviously this is a process that's already started. Obviously, governments are already responding to that. People always say, governments are doing nothing to adapt to climate change. Well, what's all the militarization of the Mediterranean and militarization of the southern border of the USA? That is adapting to future climate migration, as far as I'm concerned. I really think it is. It's a really, really difficult situation in that everything that nature teaches us about responding to climate change is that the answer is mobility. And yet the fact that we have nation states prevents mobility, not just of nature to an extent, but particularly of humans. And it's really something that needs to be seriously addressed, because the alternatives are reversing migration policies to make migration more open to people, to make the movement of people across the globe more open, or hundreds of millions of deaths. So obviously there is no alternative. There's only one choice to make there, but that's not the choice our governments are making, and we're heading very, very rapidly in the wrong direction.
I mean, I think what you're saying is that the clue's in the name, right? Conservation is a conservative space. There has been a huge criticism through the climate movement, not least from the younger quarters of XR, about conservation charities, their practices, about territories, about militarised protection of zones where actually Indigenous people live and steward the nature, get kicked off it, all of this kind of stuff, which, feels like it's a very coherent thing to discuss at the same time as questioning the nature of states. Because, I was at a meeting some months ago with some South American Indigenous women who were talking in a sort of plenary session with a bunch of other sort of global justice-minded actors, some of whom from trade union background, for example, and looking at the conflict of kind of perspectives between a group of people demanding action from the state, a group of people demanding like social justice that can come through workers pulling together within their locality, within a city, within a state, within a nation, whatever. That way of organising and viewing the world, put that next to the view of a group of Indigenous land defenders who don't want to be part of a nation state, thank you very much, then you have this kind of clash, which I don't know the bridge or the solution to it, but it feels to me like the idea that conservationists and scientists might be saying, oh no, you can't do that to nature because we're trying to keep it all natural and the same, whatever that means, this sort of imagined state of like how nature is naturally, which almost doesn't exist anywhere on Earth because we've changed everything everywhere so much. Contrast that with the stories I've been told about how many parts of the world where Indigenous people live in areas of rainforest, for example, and there are studies that say those rainforests are not Mother Nature's invention, but actually the people that live there have adapted those environments over years, and they've treated them like a garden almost, or like, you know, a landscape that they have honed, but that they know themselves to be in a sort of symbiotic relationship with, rather than something that sort of was perfect before we idiots came along and ruined it, which is very like Western view of ourselves as well as the living world, isn't it? It's like we're just the big idiots that come around, make a mess, ruin everything, kill everything, and then we go, we'd like to put it back to how it is meant to be, as if there is a way that it was meant to be. You know, if you went back far enough, you'd say, well, we need to go back to having a mile of ice on top of Scotland, which is obviously not what anyone thinks, right? So it's an interesting, it's just, I find it really interesting, these sort of perspectives that we're looking at often seem to come together in sort of, in usefully challenging ways, which actually, you know, what you've proposed in this research, I think, is, you know, this ultimately just the sacrilegious proposition that there should be a form of progressive conservationism, if you like, you know, which is not looking backwards and saying, let's make it all like it used to be, make nature great again. It's like saying, we've got to move with things that are moving fast, and we actually have tons of data about how fast it's moving. We have loads of models, we have loads of predictions. They might not be correct, but there is something to be done that's actually not pretending that you can go back in time, basically.
Well, that's it. It's you said it, pretending. You know, all we're doing is trying to bring some reality into the conversation, really. But yeah, you said it. It's, you know, conservation's problem is that we are trying to keep things in a snapshot in time, but it is just a snapshot, and it's, you know, we're a hugely dynamic and complex globe, so nothing ever stays the same. And just, I think it would be a really useful starting point to just admit nothing's ever going to stay the same. So if you can't prevent change, then you have to stop trying and you have to start trying to shape the change instead. It's just, yeah, it's quite obvious, I think.
It's the alcoholic's prayer, isn't it? Give me the wisdom to know the difference yeah. between the things that I can change and the things that I can't change. Yeah. So with that, let's just say activist update. There's a few things happening, and it's definitely something to watch in terms of Just Stop Oil hanging up their high vis and saying, you know, we're not going to do this stuff anymore. That's public disruption, yada yada. Everyone's talking about it. Everyone's been very hung up on like, what next? But there are a lot of people who are still in prison. So the campaign space may look like a major sort of radical force in the climate space has just gone, we're all going to go and sit down on the sofa instead of on the road or whatever. People might be expecting that to mean that things have calmed down. And I have thought in the past, I have to say, when I have been in a position where I thought that I might end up serving some time in jail, that it would be emotionally and personally extremely difficult to cope if you were banged up and then your movement like imploded itself and disappeared and didn't exist for you to come back out to. I don't think that that is what's happening, because I do think that the people who are working in Just Stop Oil and through XR and everything else, there's lots and lots of things happening, lots of work being planned. But for the people who are inside, you know, the reflection of the current circumstances, how they've changed in legal and political sense, it's just worth noting that at the time of recording this conversation, there are quite a few people who are stuck in jail and should actually be released. So I think some time ago we have mentioned the appeal that happened on the sentences for a very, very large number of activists. And some of those sentences were marginally reduced.
A tiny bit.
You know, I've been very vocal about the fact that these sentences were completely out of order given the nature of the circumstances and the non-violent nature of the actions themselves, and the extreme absurdity of some of the things, which really, you know, being on a Zoom call, being caught talking about the idea of doing something and not being anybody who was ever going to enact it, blah, blah, blah. These things acquiring such huge sentences, for me, then has, you know, the frame around it has been completely unhelpful, being about sentencing when really it should have been about the fundamental nature of the action, the situation, why on earth are people doing this stuff. But I think it's important for people to know, if they're not in the loop in all the sort of chats and all the spaces that we're in, that quite recently there's a doctor called, we call him Dr. Pat, and he's serving jail time right now. And recently, the special UN rapporteur for environmental defenders, Michel Forst, actually went to visit him personally, which is quite a remarkable thing. He also attended part of the Whole Truth Five's court case when Roger and others were on trial. And, you know, what's happening to Pat and others at the moment is that they are supposed to be eligible for release on tag and with like a home curfew. So you're sort of semi under home arrest. You've got to be in bed by 10 o'clock is what Roger used to say to me. But you can't get out on tag because basically the system isn't processing you in that way. So here's the part of the risk of the criminal justice or criminal injustice system, as it gets called. You know, for once you're in, you can get stuck. So aside from all of the other risks that are involved in being locked up in prison, you know, you can find yourself trapped in a bureaucratic loophole where you should be eligible for something, you can't get access to it, you can't get out. There are many people in prison on unjust terms, in my view, considering what they've done. Some of them haven't even done anything. They just were planning to do something and were stopped from doing it. So, yeah, just important to keep an eye, I guess, whilst maybe some people think the movement space has gone a bit quiet, to really shine a light on these cases, the individuals who are in prison, and the failing bureaucracy or something else, which is keeping them in there.
This is what I was going to ask. So with Pat and Roger being eligible but not being granted their release, is that purely because of a non-functional deep bureaucracy, or is it political?
It's very hard to tell, and I think there have been mention in conversations that I've seen about people in the system saying, well, we're not doing this to silence you, but we also are. You know, official communications from people who work in the probation system, for example, saying, well, it's a bit complicated and there are some higher up people paying attention to this situation precisely because of the publicity that you have gained since you received this sentence and went into prison. I mean, obviously it is political. Everything in this kind of realm is, and it's much more political now than it was some years ago, but it's very difficult at this point to ascertain, you know, how much is a system that is quite shit and doesn't really work, and how much of it is people sticking their oar into that system and saying, do not let that guy out because we think he's worse than the others because he's more famous, or we think he's worse than the others because he'll get more sympathy. So it remains to be seen sort of what's going to emerge around these cases, but certainly, you know, lots of issues that have come up, like Guy Delap. I said her name completely incorrectly, I'm sure, but the woman in Just Stop Oil who got put back in prison simply because the company didn't have the right tagging system that would fit her very small wrists.
And this is a woman in her 70s, not a threat to society.
Yeah, I mean, that, you know, that case looked to me like that they didn't do that to her because she was an extremely high profile and successful activist and a political problem. That was because a private service providing company probably just doesn't see any benefit to buying into a size range of tags that goes small enough for her because they don't need them, so they don't own any. So then instead of getting a tag, she gets put back in jail. That's private sector shit going on, but there's a load of political shit going on too. And I guess, you know, we'll keep our eyes on these cases and situations and like come back to them again and again as things unfold.
So while Just Stop Oil aren't out there doing things right now, other activists are still being arrested and prosecuted on the same sorts of charges, conspiracy charges and things like that. Tell us about the Greenpeace action that led to those arrests.
Oh yeah, so one of the co-leaders or co-directors of Greenpeace, Will, went and joined an action team that poured loads of red dye into the pond outside the American embassy just the other day, and has been arrested for criminal damage, and I think also charged with conspiracy to commit that criminal damage, which, if you have a conspiracy charge against you, it means obviously that there is a lot more evidence gathering that becomes necessary in terms of getting hold of your devices, probably raiding your house, probably raiding your office. Much more personal intrusion becomes possible. Also, because of the sentencing brackets that have been expanded for these kinds of cases, that conspiracy charge has been reported as potentially carrying up to a 10-year sentence, which sounds very scary, but what a 10-year potential sentence also gives the authorities is enormously more scope to extract anything that they can get their hands on from anything personal. Gives them lots more green light to just go into everything, so that they can do a really thorough extraction of like everything to try and prove or disprove the conspiracy, right? Which means also that you end up with an enormous court case. Usually conspiracy cases can take, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks in court. And, ones that have happened recently, I think there was one that took about 6 weeks for some Just Stop Oil activists. And it was people who were carrying some stuff because they were going to break a fence on a outskirts of an airport that they were then going to sit on the other side of that fence. They were then going to protest in a way which was going to, be disruptive, yeah, but like no plans to do anything dangerous, just to do that, that act. And the idea that you're going to spend 6 weeks in a court with a jury, with a prosecution, with the defence counsel, with the judge, all of the costs, all of the rigmarole of all of that.
Public expense.
It's massive to just try and prove that some people did intend to do a thing non-violently to try and prevent the further breakdown. And that means that all of this effort and resources spent on trying to crowbar them into a creaking, falling apart prison system that's rammed to the rafters and people having crisis meetings about. So I think what's interesting about this Greenpeace thing is that, it's something that people have described as unprecedented in that it's like the director of Greenpeace, right? And the red dye was actually, it was a protest about the genocide in Gaza. It wasn't an environmental theme completely. It was about that. But in any case, having the head of an organisation like that on the hook for a 10-year sentence for something so petty, which is basically pouring biodegradable dye into a pond, that is the system showing you a picture of precisely what these laws were built to do and what the direction of travel has been designed to be. And I think that also ties in with the Quaker Meeting House raid, which happened the other day. Group of young people talking about climate, talking about Palestine, having a meeting, first time in recorded history that the police have ever broken down the door of a Quaker Meeting House, run in there with tons of officers, raided the building, nicked a load of young people.
Some of whom were attending their first ever meeting.
No previous, inexperienced, really young people who are just coming together around what are essentially some of the most heartbreakingly awful topics that we can mobilise around in the current moment. And just looking out for these moments, they're happening more and more frequently, I think, where they just illustrate the point of where we are now and where we're probably heading. The direction of travel is towards that, not away from it.
And one thing that's particularly worrying for me about the Greenpeace arrest is that the optics of it are so terrible, and yet they went ahead with it anyway. Even though the British public has been massively poisoned against activists by media narratives, the idea of the director of Greenpeace facing 10 years in jail for putting dye in a pond is clearly scandalous to everyone and is just clearly outrageously wrong. But the fact that its obvious wrongness wasn't a deterrent to them is a concern to me. That worries me, that if they're prepared to face public scrutiny of that going on, then it really is well, not just the direction of travel, the pace of it is worrying too.
Yeah. But so speaking of activists, to close, why don't you promote your book?
Thank you. It's not often that we go all corporate and commercial on you, but scientists for Extinction Rebellion have published a book, and it's called Scientists on Survival. It's not a science book, it's a book of personal stories. So 25 of us in Scientists for XR have written just little personal stories about why we do what we do. Some of them are about the personal action they take, why they stopped flying, why they went vegan. Some are about professional things they do, why they left their job, why they transformed their career, and some are about why they've been arrested or describing their experiences in police cells. There's a lot of things I'm quite proud of about this book. I think it's a very, very powerful communications tool, and it's an interesting one to come from a group of scientists, because scientists communicate in facts and data. And as we all know, that's not how you persuade people, because we're not rational animals, we're emotional animals. And I think telling personal stories is quite powerful. The other thing I think is nice about this is the range of different types of action that are involved in these 25 stories. So there are actions about community building, stuff we've talked about before. My friend Sophie's got a chapter in here about how she started a community hydro project, a community energy project in Reading to generate energy from the Thames. So there's all sorts of different actions in there, and I think there's lots of inspiration for the different types of things we can do. And I think it might be an interesting thing to share with people that aren't already activists, because one of the things that holds people back, I think, maybe is they think the only thing they can do is you know, go and sit in the street and risk arrest. What this book shows is that there are so many things we can do in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in our community, and yes, as activists. And that inspiration, that giving people ideas about what they can do, I think is very powerful. So yeah, buy it. It's really good.
Thanks, Charlie. Well, I've got my copy, and I know it's. I've been warned that it's an emotional read, so that's what I'm taking on my holidays.
Excellent.
All right, thanks very much. Come back soon. More from news from a world in flux.
Cheers, everyone.